Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Bowler and I'm going to be your instructor for military history of the American Civil War. I want to spend a little time introducing you to the Civil War. Most historians agree that the Civil War was the biggest single event in American history. It radically altered the nation in many ways. The United States became a unified nation because of the war. Before the war, people would often say the United States are, and after the war, people would say the United States is. So you see that citizens went from viewing this country as a combination of individual states to kind of a unified nation. Some of the most important constitutional amendments were passed during and right after the Civil War, including the abolition of slavery, the right for black men to vote, and due process of law. The idea that secession could take place was killed by the Civil War. One section of the country lay in ruins after it experienced total war. In fact, the Southern people are the only Americans in history to experience the devastations of total war. Conscription happened for the first time in American history, first for the Confederacy and then for the Union. The amount of money spent by the federal government dramatically increased. The size of the federal government increased exponentially. America experienced its first assassination of a president, and a whole list of other changes occurred. So kind of as we move throughout this course, hopefully you'll kind of pick up on some of the ways the country changed because of the Civil War. Now, a lot has been written on the Civil War. In the 150 years since the Civil War began, something like 50,000 books, papers, and pamphlets have been written. So that's basically a book, paper, or pamphlet a day has been written since the start of the Civil War. That means you could spend your whole lifetime reading and not exhaust all of the material on the Civil War. And just to illustrate that point, here's a tower of books about Abraham Lincoln. Now, this tower includes about 7,000 books. It's about 35 feet high. It has a circumference of 8 feet. One historian has estimated that there are about 15,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln, so this is about half the books on Lincoln. So you could just spend a lifetime and not even cover everything over the Civil War. But we're going to try to do our best in this course. So I just want to introduce you to some basic facts about the Civil War. You'll learn more about these things as we go along. But the Civil War was fought from 1861 to 1865. The war was between 22 northern states. Now, in fact, not all those states were northern. A better way of putting it is that the 22 states that remained in the Union, they weren't all in the North. And there were 11 Confederate states. Those are the ones that seceded. Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States during the Civil War. He's the most important political leader in the North. He was a Republican, and his election in 1860 is why the first 7 states of the Confederacy seceded. So technically, Lincoln's election got the ball rolling on the start of the Civil War. Excuse me. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. He's the most important leader in the South as far as the political side. Robert E. Lee is the most important person overall, probably. Jefferson Davis was a Democrat. He was a senator from Mississippi when secession began, and he resigned from the U.S. Senate in January of 1861 to go join his home state. And later, in February 1861, he was appointed president of the Confederacy by the Montgomery Convention. The most important generals fighting for the Union were Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, Philip H. Sheridan, and George H. Thomas. By the end of the war, these are probably the 4 most important generals on the Union side, but there's a lot of other generals along the way. Henry W. Halleck, George B. McClellan, George Gordon Meade, William S. Rosecrans, Joseph Hooker, Ambrose E. Burnside, and Don Carlos Buell. The most important generals fighting for the Confederacy were Robert E. Lee. He's the most important. Joseph E. Johnston, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, P.G.T. Beauregard, Jeb Stuart, Braxton Bragg, Albert Sidney Johnston. There's some other ones that are also important. John C. Pemberton, Leonidas Polk, John Bell Hood, Jubal Early, Richard Ewell, A.P. Hill. Kind of as we go throughout this course, you'll get to know some of these generals. Now, there's basically 2 main theaters during the Civil War. The Eastern Theater, that covers mostly Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia. There's the Western Theater. It includes states west of the Appalachian Mountains, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia. There's also another theater called the Trans-Mississippi Theater, basically everything kind of west of the Mississippi River. There's also a naval war going on in the Atlantic and in the Gulf of Mexico, and kind of throughout the whole world. There's naval battles, halfway across the world. But we're mostly going to focus on the Eastern Theater, mostly Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and then the Western Theater. So if you look at this map I've got up here, that's basically where the fighting is going to take place. The two most important armies in the Eastern Theater are the Army of the Potomac, that's the Union Army, and the most important Confederate army in the Eastern Theater is the Army of Northern Virginia. The most important armies in the Western Theater on the Union side are the Army of the Tennessee, the Army of the Cumberland, and the Army of the Ohio. The most important Confederate army out west is the Army of Tennessee. It was originally known as the Army of Mississippi, but for most of the Civil War, it's called the Army of Tennessee. And you'll kind of notice that the Union tends to name its armies after rivers. The Potomac, the Tennessee, the Cumberland, the Ohio, those are all important rivers in the Civil War, whereas the Confederates named their armies after states. So the Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of Tennessee, those are Confederate armies. I wanted to kind of go over some of the battle deaths to kind of give you a picture, give you an appreciation for how big the Civil War was. If you added up all the battles in the Civil War, so all the minor skirmishes, all the way to huge battles like Gettysburg, basically there were 10,000 engagements in the Civil War. 2.1 to 2.2 million men served in Union armies. 360,000 of them died. That's a death rate of almost 17%. On the Confederate side, somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million men served in the Confederate armies. 260,000 Confederate soldiers died. That's a death rate of 33%. So total deaths, you have 620,000 killed. That's a study from the late 1800s. A more recent study has put the number at around 850,000, but I'm going to use the 620,000 kind of for this comparison. So 620,000 killed, 1.1 million wounded. Now that's just soldiers, not civilians. The Civil War killed 1.94% of the population, so almost 2% of the population. We can compare the Civil War to other wars just to understand how deadly it was. So if you look at this list, the death rates in the American Revolution were about 5%. The War of 1812 was 2.5%. The Mexican War, 5%. The Spanish-American War, 1%. World Wars I and II, over 5%. The Korean War, 2.5%. Vietnam, 7%. But the Civil War for the North, 17% of Northern soldiers died, and 33% of Confederate soldiers died. So the Civil War killed way more proportionally of the armies engaged in the Civil War. The Civil War was very costly in terms of money. In 1860, so the last year of peace, the federal budget was $63 million, so that's the entire federal budget. In 1865, the last year of the war, the federal budget was $1.3 billion. That's an increase of over 200%. It's estimated that the North alone spent $6 billion on the war. The war was especially costly on the South. 2/3 of the assessed wealth of the South was wiped out. Now, most of the South's wealth was in land and slaves, so the Civil War killed slavery, so that's why the South lost most of its wealth. But they lost other things as well. 1/4 of the white males of military age were killed, and another quarter were maimed. 2/5 of the South's livestock was killed. More than half of the South's farm machinery was destroyed. Southern railroads, Southern industry, the Southern countryside was destroyed. So the South really experienced total war, more like what was experienced in the 20th century with the two world wars. So I want to do a side-by-side comparison to give you an impression about how big the Civil War really was. So we already said 360,000 Yankees died, 260,000 rebels died, so that's a total of 620,000. The population of the United States in 1860 was 31 million. That includes 4 million slaves living in the South. So let's assume that the population of the United States today is 330 million. If you take that 1.94% that was killed during the Civil War and apply it to today's numbers, that means that 6.4 million Americans would be killed if we had a civil war today. And that's just a staggering number to think about. The bloodiest day of the Civil War was the Battle of Antietam. It took place in Maryland on September 17th, 1862. Union casualties, 2,010 killed, 9,416 wounded, 1,043 missing. So they had total casualties of 12,469 out of 75,000 engaged. Confederate casualties at Antietam were 2,700 killed, 9,024 wounded, and 2,000 missing. So they had total casualties of 13,274 out of 40,000 engaged. So the total casualties just that one day, 25,743. Now, if we had a battle of that magnitude today in the United States, that means just over 1.2 million Americans would be engaged, just over 50,000 would be killed, almost 200,000 would be wounded, over 30,000 missing, and the total casualties would be 278,000. The biggest overall battle in the Civil War was the Battle of Gettysburg. This was a 3-day battle that took place in Pennsylvania in July of 1863. Union casualties were 3,155 killed, 14,529 wounded, and 5,365 missing. Total casualties, 23,049 out of 85,000 men engaged. Confederate casualties were 2,592 killed, 12,709 wounded, and 5,150 missing. So the Confederates suffered total casualties of 20,451 out of 65,000 men engaged. So total casualties on both sides were about 50,000. If you add up those numbers, it's a little lower, but we don't really know how many Confederates died or were wounded. So generally, historians say 50,000 casualties at Gettysburg. Maybe they just like 50,000 as a number. It sounds better than 43,000. If we had a battle today of that magnitude, about 1.6 million Americans would take place. Over 61,000 would be killed. Almost 300,000 wounded. 111,000 would be missing. So we would have total casualties of almost 500,000. That's kind of hard to fathom today. Now, one of the single bloodiest instances of the Civil War took place in the summer of 1864 when Grant assaulted Lee's positions at Cold Harbor. In less than 1 hour, Grant suffered 75,000 casualties. In today's numbers, that would be almost 80,000 casualties. Now, that's not all killed, but many of those were killed. So today, that would be like experiencing 80,000 casualties in less than an hour. That's the equivalent of 27 9/11 attacks in less than 1 hour. So that kind of gives you an impression of how big these battles were. Now, I just wanted to kind of introduce things to you, let you see me. As we move throughout this course, we'll kind of learn more about the Civil War, obviously. At the end of the course, if you really want to learn more about the Civil War, I will make a video recommending books. I've got a ton of good books to read. If you want to read about a certain general, if you want to read about just a general narrative that goes deeper, I've got some more books that just focus on what caused the Civil War. They don't even get into battles. So I got a ton of stuff to recommend, and I'll kind of post something at the end of the course. But I hope you enjoy this course. I really love the Civil War. I love learning about it, and hopefully this is a good experience for you.